Hello everybody, welcome to Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, we're just going to be talking about sort of the chemical principles that are involved in life and how that relates to human anatomy and physiology. So a lot of you probably have had some basic chemistry in the past. This won't be that much different from what you already have, so it's kind of a review chapter. However, I will note that I'm skipping some of the ideas that are found in your chapter. So do make sure you go to utilize the notes and the resources to make sure you get everything that you need course material wise. So the first thing we'll talk about is chemistry is important in anatomy and physiology because there are so many physiological reactions, meaning the body's made up of many chemicals, and so all of these physiological reactions involve chemistry. This includes movement, digestion, how the part pumps blood throughout the system, your nervous system responses. All of these are made up of chemicals. And so it's very, very important that we understand how chemistry is involved. So chemistry, at least for our purposes, if you're a chemist, it's broken down even more than this. But at least for our purposes, chemistry can be broken down into the basic chemistry that you can think of. What are atoms? What are molecules? Those kinds of things. And then biochemistry. And that is sort of how those chemical reactions happen and proceed through living systems. In our case, human systems and their physiological functions. So biochemistry is a really important field of both biology and chemistry because it tells us how things work in these living systems, and that's really important. So some basic chemistry. Again, this is just really basic, kind of going through some definitions of some things that that you might encounter throughout anatomy and physiology. First is matter. Matter is anything that has mass and occupies space. So matter can be seen, smelled, felt, touched, that kind of thing. Weight is mass plus the effects of gravity. So the gravity that's pushing down. So our body experiences gravity and even atmospheric pressure. So basically we get our weight from gravity that is pushing down on us. And so that produces a force against us or onto us. And so our body, our physiological responses respond to that, or we have to address that in our body. When I say address that, I mean our physiological responses. Of course, as you know from probably early on in school, there's just different states of matter. So matter can exist in the solid, liquid, and gaseous state. Solid, of course, has this definite shape and volume. That liquid has that changeable shape, that definite volume. And gas, of course, changeable shape and volume. And so we experience different things in our body through these different states of matter. In addition, energy. Energy plays a huge role in how we function and survive. We undergo our physiological processes, metabolic processes, and things like that. So energy is the capacity to do work or put that matter into motion. So energy itself doesn't have mass, nor does it take up space. It's just this capacity or the ability to put some matter into motion. So the greater the work done, the more energy it uses up. And here's a image or a animation about this. Okay, so you can watch that animation again, either through this recording or through the PowerPoints that are provided to you. So again, the video talked about kinetic versus potential energy. So those two forms, kinetic energy, of course, is that energy in action, and potential energy is that inactive or stored energy. And energy is transformed from that potential to kinetic. So stored energy can be released, which that results in an action. This is really, really important for our biological systems and in physiology, because our energy, we do need that energy. We do need to be able to take stored energy and have that released, resulting in action, whether that is a nervous system reaction or whether that is a any kind of reaction in the bones, the muscles, etc. So there are several forms of energy as well. Chemical energy, which is stored within the bonds of those chemical substances, and those plays a huge role in our metabolism and things like that, the biochemistry that we go through. Electrical energy, that's sort of the results of the movement of charged particles. Mechanical, involved in moving matter. And radiant or electromagnetic energy, so waves like heat, visible light, X-rays, and so forth. So you can see we use a lot of different forms of energy through our body, through anatomy and physiology. So we do have, energy does go through these conversions. So energy can be converted from one form to another. Turning on a lamp, for example, converts that electrical energy into light energy. But energy conversion is inefficient. So energy is lost as heat, and that's basically partly unusable. So you can even think of when we run and when we do activities, we're releasing heat through our body, and that's because the conversion is not perfect. That actually works out for us, though, because that's one of the ways that we can lose weight, because energy conversion is so inefficient. That energy is released as heat, we break those things down, and of course that helps us lose weight. So we do lose that energy lost as heat. That part is unusable. That's not so great for a system in which you're trying to create something, or like an engine for a car. We lose a lot of that gas is just lost to the environment and not even utilized. But in our body, we use this, that can be to our advantage. Atoms and elements. So all matter, when we're talking about that, is composed of elements. So those are elements or substances that can't really be broken down into similar substances by these ordinary chemical methods. There are 4 of these elements that make up 96% of our body. So carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. These are essential. These are going to be making up the major macromolecules that we utilize in our body. 9 elements make up 3.9% of the body, and then 11 other elements make up less than 0.01% of the body. So these 4 major elements make up mostly our body. That's a carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. But we still have others, and those are just essential. Just because they're in lesser forms, or lesser amounts, I should say, doesn't mean that they're not important or essential. So this is just sort of the composition of those elements in the human body. Oxygen, of course, that's going to be about 65%. It's all of the carbon, like organic molecules and inorganic molecules. It helps us utilize or create or kind of generate that ATP energy that we need. Carbon is about 18.5%. That's also a part of all organic molecules, including carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, which we'll talk a little bit about. Hydrogen's about 9.5% of the body mass, and so it helps us with regards to influencing the pH of body fluids, balancing that out. It's a component of organic molecules as well. And nitrogen is about 3.2%. This is important for our genetic material. So those are what makes up proteins, it makes up nucleic acids, and that's basically the maintenance of our genetic material. Some lesser things that compose the human body but are just as important: calcium, of course, found in bones and teeth, also required for muscle contractions, the ionic version of it, muscle impulses, and blood clotting. Phosphorus, it's basically, it's part of a calcium phosphate. It's present in nucleic acids, it's present in bones and teeth, part of phospholipids and things like that. Potassium, basically it is an ion in cells. It's a positive ion or cation, but it's necessary for the conduction of nerve impulses and muscle contractions, so very, very important. Sulfur, component of proteins, especially muscle proteins. Sodium, basically it is an ion, and it's a major positive ion that's found in the extracellular fluids, and so that's important for water balance and conduction of nerve impulses and muscle contractions. Chlorine, basically it is a negative ion in the extracellular fluids. Magnesium, present in the bone. Basically, it helps with some metabolic reactions as well. Iodine, it's helped to make your thyroid hormone functional. And iron, which is a component of hemoglobin, and that helps transport oxygen with red blood cells and some enzymes and things like that. So think about that. Even though this is small amounts of percentage of body mass that it takes up, all of these are essential. Just as essential as some of those most common ones that we see. Now we do combine matter, so these basically elements can be combined into compounds, so most atoms generally combine with others. So molecule, general term for two or more atoms bonded together. We have lots of essential molecules in our body that helps all of the functioning of each of our systems. And then the compound is a specific molecule that has two or more different kinds of atoms bonded together. An example is C6H12O6. That is a molecule, but it's also a compound because it has two or more different kinds of atoms, and that is common glucose, basically the sugar that primarily runs our body. Molecules with just one type of atom, like H2 or O2, we just call those molecules. But C6H12O6 is still a molecule, but it's specifically a compound because it has multiple different types of atoms that are bonded together. Chemical bonds are energy relationships between electrons and reacting atoms. So chemical bonds are not actual physical features. They're just this energy relationship. So electrons are these subatomic particles that are involved in all chemical reactions. They determine whether a reaction will take place, and if so, what type of chemical bond will form. And there are different types of chemical bonds. So you have ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. A covalent bond is one of the strongest bonds. So many of the bonds in our body, between the molecules in our body, are covalently bonded together. Hydrogen bonds is a weak bond, and some of the bonds in our body are this. Not all, because you can imagine, if covalent bonds are strong, that's important because we don't want our molecules falling apart and our cells just falling apart. So they're mostly made up of these covalent bonds. But there's sometimes that we might want a bond to be able to come apart easily. An example of a hydrogen bond in our body is our DNA. DNA also contains covalent bonds on, if you think of DNA as the rungs of a ladder, you've got the rungs of the ladder and then the little sides. Covalently bonded is at the sides. It's where the covalence of bond. Specifically, it's a phosphodiester bond, but you don't need to know that. But the rungs hold the bases together. We'll talk more about its structure later, but it holds those bases together. But to replicate it needs to easily come apart, like unzip, like a zipper. And it's held by hydrogen bonds there because slight increases in temperature can break them apart, and some basically increase in temperature will break them apart, and then a decrease in temperature will help hold them back together. So that helps with the replication of the DNA molecule. So while most of the bonds in our body are covalent, we do have some hydrogen bonds that are really, really important for us. So the next part of the chapter is just going to be talking about how chemistry relates to anatomy. So the biochemistry side. So biochemistry is just the study of the chemical composition and the reactions that occur within living matter. So within living systems, within living things. And so all chemicals are either organic or inorganic. So inorganic compounds are things like water and salts and a lot of acids and bases. They really do not contain carbon. Organic compounds, I should say, basically are things like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and nucleic acids, and they contain carbon. Typically, they're very large, covalently bonded molecules. Both inorganic and organic molecules or compounds are essential for life on Earth. For us to survive, we have to have these abilities. We need the inorganic compounds like water and salts, and balancing our pHs, our acids and bases. Very, very important for physiological functioning. But organic compounds are too. We have to have these carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, nucleic acids in order to function. So both are essential to us. So the most abundant inorganic compound that we have is water. That accounts for 60 to 80% of the volume of living cells. So most important organic compound because of its properties. Really, there's a lot of things that really helps really helps make water the most, not only abundant, but the most important inorganic compound. One, it has a high heat capacity, meaning it has this capacity to hold a lot of heat. And so it takes a lot to kind of get that water to go away. It can hold that heat and maintain, for us, help us with body temperature. High heat of vaporization, too. It means it takes a lot of energy to evaporate or get rid of water. So if it was another inorganic compound that was a liquid, it may vaporize a lot quicker. Think about alcohol. Alcohol, if you pour a little bit of alcohol or spray a little bit of alcohol on a surface, it dries up really quick, even when it's cold. Well, water doesn't. If you spray water on the table, yeah, it'll start evaporating, but it takes longer than spraying alcohol, right? Well, that's important for us. That's important for our body because we don't want it to evaporate too quickly. We need it to evaporate if we work hard and do things, but we don't want it to instantaneously evaporate. So that's important for us. It's a polar solvent, meaning that it can dissolve have things dissolve into it, and so things can distribute or diffuse within water, and that's very important. It also acts as cushioning and for reactivity. And so those things are important. It's an inorganic compound that really allows for life for a lot of different reasons. Salts are ionic compounds. They dissociate into separate ions in water. Separate into these cations, either positively charged molecules, and anions are negatively charged. And so basically salts are really important in our system. We talked about just a minute ago, it helps with signaling and things like that in our muscles and nervous systems. And so those are really important. We talk about salt in our diet being bad. Well, too much salt is. Too little salt is. We kind of need a balance of salt in order for the functioning of our physiological system. So all ions are also called electrolytes, and because they can conduct electrical currents in a solution. So basically, lots of ions play specialized roles. So we have things like sodium, which is the salt, potassium, calcium, iron. And so basically balancing each of these things are super important to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is just the ability of our body to balance, whether it's temperature, in this case ions, and so on. Some common salts in the body are basically sodium chloride is a big one, the table salt, different calcium phosphates, and so on, calcium carbonate here, and so on, potassium chloride. And so basically those are really essential in the functioning of a system. Acids and bases are both electrolytes, basically ionize and dissociate in water. Acids are proton donors, so they release these hydrogen ions. They bear protons. They have no electrons in that solution. So an example is hydrochloric acid will dissociate into H plus and Cl negative ions there. And then, of course, the important acids, hydrochloric acid is very important. It helps break down food in our stomach. Acetic acid, things like that are also... This is acetic acid here, also abbreviated HAC, just to help, so you don't have to write that out every time. And then, of course, carbonic acid. Each of these do different things in our body in order to sort of help balance or maintain homeostasis in our system. Bases essentially are proton acceptors, so they pick up a hydrogen ion in a solution. So an example is NaOH, basically salt, Na plus OH negative. When a base dissolves in solution, it releases a hydroxyl ion, OH negative. Some important bases are the bicarbonate ion, HCO3 negative, and ammonia as well, NH3. Bicarbonate ion is really important because it helps maintain the pH of blood. So if the pH gets too high or too low, it can release or take away bicarbonate ions in order to balance that out. Sorry. The pH scale and the pH values of representative substance. So typically we show a pH scale from 0 to 14. And of course, you can see 0 down here is more acidic. Up here in the blue side to 14 is more basic. And so what you see is some substances that you can kind of commonly know. So hydrochloric acid, way down here at a pH of between 0 and 2. The stomach acid, which is hydrochloric acid in our body, has about a pH of 2. So very, very acidic. Lemon juice is also around that area. Wine as well. Coffee, a little acidic. Perfectly neutral is water. Your blood is about a pH of 7.2 to 7.4, so it's very, very close to water. You can see things like egg whites are a little basic. Household ammonia and bleaches and stuff are basic. Sodium hydroxide, of course, is very, very basic. So you can kind of see these common things. Oven cleaners, very basic. So you see the scale. Our body does have different pHs in different parts of the systems to help us function. Now talking about some of these major macromolecules that uses these compounds and things to sort of help us survive. The first one, of course, is carbohydrates. That includes sugars and starches. They contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 2-to-1 ratio. So hydrogen has this it's a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So for every 1 carbon, you'll have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. There are 3 classes of these. Monosaccharides, which has 1 sugar. It's the smallest unit of a carbohydrate. We call those monomers. Disaccharide has 2 sugars. Polysaccharides has 3 many sugars, so basically more than 2. Polymers are just basically made of monomers of monosaccharides. So these are some of the examples of a monosaccharide. Glucose, C6H12O6 is one. Fructose, lactose, deoxyribose, and ribose. And I should say, you see these sugars, deoxyribose and ribose, mostly in DNA and RNA, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Disaccharides, sucrose is just a combination of glucose and fructose. Maltose is glucose and glucose together, and lactose is galactose and glucose bonded together. And so that's those common disaccharides you see. Polysaccharides, of course, very, very long chains that are linked to monosaccharides. One of those is glycogen. So basically you just have this different glucose molecules linked together, and that's an example of a polysaccharide. The next molecule that's really important are the lipids. They contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but there are less than in carbohydrates. Some of them do have phosphorus in them. They are insoluble in water, of course, and there are main types of things like triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, and eicosanoids. So triglycerides basically consist of a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. This here is your fatty acid. The head here is your glycerol. And so you can kind of see that structure and what it looks like there. Triglycerides, like I said, there are typically 3 fatty acids. So you see your triglyceride over here as a whole with those 3 fatty acids. So it has one molecule, this whole thing of glycerol. And then, of course, these fatty acids that are joined together with that to make that triglyceride. So you can see this is a simplified drawing. So this is more of a more structural, seeing all of the elements as they are in there. But here is how it be represented more simply. Still, it's your triglyceride with 3 fatty acids and a glycerol head. And here's an animation that we can look at for that. Okay, and if you want to review that again, you can go to the PowerPoint and it'll show you, you can watch that again. Saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. So it mentions this a little bit in the video, but basically what you hear is a saturated fat is at room temperature, it basically like butter, it's packed together forming a solid. This is because it is a straight chain because it has no double bonds. So you see it's just got one, each line represents that bond. There's no double bonds there. So it forms this very straight sort of fat, which allows it to be solid at room temperature. But then we have oils, and oils basically are liquid at room temperature. And so you can sort of see here basically a double bond in one that kinks the chain or bends it. It's a chemical way in chemistry of bending a molecule is to form a double bond there. So it bends or kinks the chain. And because it's not ordered and structured or packed, it is then liquid. So the double bonds that are there basically make that lipid an oil instead of a fat, like we saw before. There are also phospholipids. Those are really important structures for us. They make up our cell membrane. And so you have these fatty acids, a glycerol, and it has a phosphate group. It is a polar head, so it's basically hydrophilic, meaning this part loves the water, so it points towards the water. And then the end is nonpolar, so they're hydrophobic. They fear the water, so they point toward each other, creating a double membrane structure. So this is that phospholipid structure. This is that water-loving head, and then the tails that fear the water, so they point towards each other, creating this double membrane. So the heads point towards the watery environment, whether it's outside of the cell or inside of the cell, and the tails point toward each other, forming this double layer, which creates that outside cell structure for us. Another type of lipid is steroids. And of course, the steroid hormones and things like that, they are kind of in these little groupings, or what looks like to a lot of people honeycomb. They're hydrocarbon rings. Basically, steroids are things like cholesterol. This is showing cholesterol here, but estrogen and testosterone are also steroids, and steroids basically are lipids. The next group are the proteins. That comprises 20 to 30% of the cell mass. They have the most varied function of any molecules because they have structural components. They act as enzymes, which allows processes and chemical interactions to happen, and they actually help for contraction of muscles. And so they contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur and phosphorus as well. Polymers of amino acids, monomers, are held together by peptide bonds, and there's specific shape, 4 structural levels for a protein. And so here you can see some examples of these protein functions, some structural proteins that provides things like mechanical support, such as collagen, which is found in connective tissues. And sort of that is the single most abundant protein in the body, responsible for tensile strength of bones, tendons, ligaments, and so on. And then you have the enzyme proteins. They act as a catalyst. So for reactions that either happen too slow or don't happen at all, these proteins can come in and allow that process to happen. And they're essentially, basically, virtually essential for every single biochemical reaction in the body. So, for instance, disaccharides hydrolyze, the disaccharides, proteases hydrolyze proteins, and oxidases oxidize food fuels. Very hard to say that. And then transport proteins. So that's moving substances, whether it's in blood or plasma membranes, anything like that. So such as hemoglobin, which transports oxygen in the blood. Some proteins, such as ions, will cross the plasma membrane and things like that. You can have these contractile proteins, which helps for movement. Things like actin and myosin for muscle cell contraction. We'll learn about that in the muscular system. You can have communication proteins that send signals from one place to another. We call those chemical messengers. Hormones fall in this category. And defensive proteins, which actually protect against disease, such as the antibodies. So when you say the proteins are the most diverse and, has the most functions, you can see there's a ton of functions that it does. So all proteins are made up of 20 amino acids, and basically they are joined by covalent bonds called peptide bonds. They both contain an amine and an acid group, and so they can either act as an acid or a base. So they differ they're all the same, except that they differ by which R group is present. And like I said, there are 20 of those R groups. R groups are just the amino acid. So you can see the structure here. You have this amine group, and then, of course, an acid group, and you have this functional R group. So this is what we call a carboxylic acid group, and you could call it Q group if you want. And then, of course, the R group and an amine group. It's all amino acids, like I said, are the same except for this. There's 20 different options you have for this. They are linked together by peptide bonds through a process called basically dehydration synthesis. They can be taken apart by hydrolysis. But basically, you see two of them form together to form this dipeptide that's here. So there are different structures to a protein. We mentioned there are 4 different structures. There's the primary structure, which is just the chain of amino acids. It's just a sequence of amino acids. This is not a functioning protein. It's just the primary structure of it being put together. The secondary structure of the protein is it's held together in a helix. It's bonded either through these little like spiral alpha helices, or these sheets that bend like this up and down called beta pleated sheets. And so that's that secondary structure held together with a bond. And then we have tertiary structure, and that's when you have this, you got secondary structure like you saw back here, with that alpha helices and beta pleated sheets, but they folded and compacted to form this globular molecule that's held together by these intramolecular bonds. And so basically, that's what's forming a protein. This is, in a lot of cases, is a functional protein. And then there's quaternary, and that's when 2 or more polypeptide chains come together and interact. That is a functional protein as well. And so basically you can see it's just basically this very complex protein that can form. If you denature a protein, take it from its active structure and apply too much heat to it, you can denature it back to its primary structure, making it ineffective. This is why things like super high fevers are dangerous to us. If we have a super high fever, it goes too high, you start denaturing the proteins in your body, specifically in your brain, and they denature. Can cause brain damage and death. Once the protein is denatured and goes to that primary shape, it can never refold back into an active function, active functioning protein ever again. And so that's where we get the problem with having too much of damage to due to protein, too high of a fever, as an example. Here's a video about protein structure. Okay, so that's a little bit about that protein structure and the 4 levels, which I've already explained, so you can go back and see that in your notes as well. So I mentioned protein denaturation already. These globular proteins unfold, they lose that 3D shape. They no longer function. This can be caused by a decrease in pH, increase in temperature, things like that. So the example is, you have this egg. You cannot undo cooking an egg. Once you heat that and change those proteins in it, it's done, right? So the egg normally functions as an egg. You can cook it and eat it, and that's fine for you to eat it, but you've denatured those proteins and you can't undo it. So that's the same as if we have extremely high fevers. You start denaturing those proteins and you can't undo that. You change what we call their conformational shape, and they no longer work anymore. Enzymes, I've mentioned before. Enzymes are these globular proteins that act as biological catalysts. A catalyst is just something that allows a reaction to happen. So catalysts regulate and increase speed of chemical reactions without getting used up in the process. So the lower the energy needed to initiate the chemical reaction, the better off it's going to happen. It leads to an increase in the speed of the reaction, or it allows for it to happen more often, for millions of reactions per minute. That's essential for life. So this is what we call activation energy. So basically, if you didn't have an enzyme, let's say you have a biological process and you have this starting point. And what you need is energy to make it happen. Well, you have to build up a lot of energy if you don't have an enzyme. This from here to here is called what we call the activation energy. We have to have the energy to make it happen, to activate it. That's a pretty steep hill to climb. And then, of course, we'll get the product as the progress of the reaction happens. However, if we have these protein enzymes, these enzymes that act as a catalyst, basically, if it's present, it doesn't take as much to get the process going. It's like it gives it a kick, like if you're kicking a kickball or something. Here, you don't have somebody kicking it, and you're waiting for the wind to blow whenever it does. Here, you got somebody there to kick it. And so you see that activation energy is a lot lower. Remember, without the enzyme, it took a lot, right? With it, not so much. So it gets over that hump faster. So not only can it happen faster, it can happen more often. And so enzymes are extremely important to help every single biochemical reaction we have in our body. Nucleic acids is that 4th type of macromolecule. It's composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. They are the largest molecules in the body. Nucleic acid polymers are made of monomers called nucleotides, basically composed of a nitrogenous base, a sugar, and a phosphate group. There are 2 major classes, the deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, and ribonucleic acid, RNA. So these are basically our genetic, what holds our genetic information and what makes protein. So DNA, again, holds that genetic blueprint for that synthesis of the proteins, double-stranded helical molecule, double helix, located in the cell nucleus. You have these nucleotides basically contain this deoxyribose sugar. If you're DNA, you always have the sugar that's called deoxyribose. It has 1 less oxygen in it. A phosphate group and one of the 4 bases, adenine or guanine or cytosine and thymine. So one of these to make up that nitrogenous bases. So the structure of DNA, of course, looks like this. It's a double helix. Circled. We know a lot more about the double helix than we did, a long time ago. There is 10 bases or 10 rungs in the ladder for a complete turn. And not that you need to know this, that one complete turn is a length of 34 angstroms with the space between each base at 3.4 angstroms. You don't need to know that. It's just kind of cool that we do. So that's sort of that structure of DNA. If you remember when I talked about bonds earlier on in the chapter, and I said we have strong bonds that are covalent bonds, and we have hydrogen bonds that are weak bonds. Well, the bonds that hold the sugar and phosphate together here, you see this is the phosphate, this is the sugar that's held here. The bond that occurs here is a covalent bond. It is very strong. We don't want that DNA molecule to fall apart, right? We want that ladder to maintain. However, between the bases here, which we found here, between the A and T and C's and G's, that's a hydrogen bond. That's important because we want to be able for the molecule to kind of unzip or come apart so it can copy itself. And so we need that to be a weak bond that's between the rungs of those letters. So that weak bond is here, 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 here. So it can unzip. The strong bonds are located along this sugar phosphate backbone because we don't want that part to come apart. We want that to stay. And so that's sort of that structure of DNA. The other nucleic acid that we typically talk about is RNA. Basically, RNA is this intermediate that links DNA to protein synthesis. It's slightly different from DNA. It's single-stranded in most things. If you take microbiology, you'll learn that viruses have some double-stranded RNA. But for our purposes, RNA is single-stranded. It contains the ribose sugar, not the deoxyribose. And instead of uracil that you find in DNA, you find thymine in RNA. And there are 3 varieties of this RNA: messenger RNA, transfer RNA, and ribosomal RNA. And all of these are involved in the process of protein synthesis, which is really important. And here's an animation on DNA and RNA. Okay, so that's that animation on DNA and RNA. So you can check that back out in your notes if you want to rewatch it as well. So ATP, that's the chemical energy that is released when glucose is broken down and captured in ATP, what we call adenosine triphosphate. It is also a nucleic acid that falls under that 4th category that we're talking about with DNA and RNA. But ATP directly powers chemical reactions in cells. So it offers this immediate usable energy that's needed by the body cells. And so the structure of ATP is this adenine-containing RNA molecule with 2 additional phosphate groups. So it looks very similar to RNA in some cases, but it does have these phosphate groups attached to that. So this is the structure of adenosine triphosphate. You see this adenosine here, there's this ribose sugar here, and then of course you got 3 phosphate groups. The energy that's held in ATP is held between the phosphate groups. And so what that means is basically you can get the stored energies here. So when you need energy, basically it will break this bond here between the phosphates, and basically what you would get is that burst of energy from it. And then of course when you need to make ATP, this phosphate dissociates off. When you need to make it, that phosphate will be stuck back on. And so that bonds our energy that makes us do all these functions is found just in this bond here. It's quite amazing how that works. So that's a little bit of chapter 2. So make sure to go through and utilize all the course materials. Really dig it deep into those 4 major macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids. I think I said them all. I hope I didn't mean one. Lipids, yeah. So make sure you dive into those. Make sure you learn about all their different properties. Of course, there's much more in the chapter than I covered here, so do make sure you go through that and utilize that material. But I hope everyone has a wonderful day. If you have any questions, please reach out and let me know, and I'll see you in the next chapter.